In 1851, a Catholic convent in rural Louisiana operated under the sacred veil of religious devotion, but behind its whitewashed walls, a darker truth flourished in silence. The Sisters of Divine Mercy maintained a plantation worked by 18 enslaved women who lived under conditions so severe that neighboring planters whispered about it in hushed tones. These women weren't just laborers. They were participants in what church records would later call a sanctified breeding program, orchestrated by the Mother Superior herself. For over a century, the convent's role in slavery remained buried in sealed archives, protected by religious immunity and institutional silence. The 18 women who lived and died within those walls left no written testimony, no names in official ledgers, and no graves marked with their identities. Their existence was deliberately erased from parish records, hidden beneath layers of pious documentation and charitable work that painted the convent as a beacon of mercy. It wasn't until 2019 that a doctoral student researching Southern religious institutions stumbled upon a cache of letters in the New Orleans Archdiocese archives. The correspondence, written between 1849 and 1865, revealed a systematic operation that blended religious authority with the brutal economics of human bondage. The letters spoke of sanctified unions, blessed offspring, and divine multiplication, coded language for a forced reproduction program that operated under the guise of Christian charity. The discovery sent shockwaves through historical and religious communities. How could a religious institution, dedicated to mercy and compassion, orchestrate such systematic cruelty? The answer lay in the intersection of religious authority, economic necessity, and the dehumanization inherent in slavery itself. The convent had found a way to reconcile its spiritual mission with the profitability of enslaved labor, creating a theological framework that justified the unjustifiable. What makes this case particularly haunting is the complete erasure of these women's identities. Unlike other plantation records that at least documented names and births, the convent's ledgers referred to the enslaved women only by numbers and functions. Breeder 1, washerwoman 3, nursemaid 7. These clinical designations stripped away every trace of humanity, reducing women to their economic utility within a religious institution. Today, historians call it religious crime, a deliberate betrayal of sacred trust that used divine authority to mask systematic abuse. The 18 women who suffered within those walls deserve to be remembered, not as numbers in a ledger, but as human beings whose voices were silenced by an institution that claimed to speak for God. Chapter 1. The Sealed Archive. For 168 years, a small wooden box sat forgotten in the climate-controlled vaults of the New Orleans Archdiocese. Measuring no more than 12 inches across, it bore no markings except a faded Latin inscription, Sub Rosa, under the rose, a phrase meaning secrecy. Inside lay correspondence that would rewrite the history of religious institutions during American slavery, revealing a truth so disturbing that church officials had deliberately hidden it from public view since 1865. Dr. Amelia Thornton wasn't looking for scandal when she requested access to the archive in September 2019. The Yale historian was researching charitable work by Catholic institutions in the antebellum South, expecting to find records of orphanages, schools, and medical care. What she discovered instead was evidence of systematic human rights violations orchestrated by the Sisters of Divine Mercy, a small convent near Baton Rouge that operated between 1847 and 1863. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. The first letter Thornton opened was dated March 12, 1851, written by Mother Superior Catherine Beaumont to Bishop Henri Marchand. The elegant cursive handwriting described the convent's divine mission in language that seemed innocuous at first glance. Beaumont wrote of 18 souls under our spiritual care and blessed unions that serve God's purpose. She discussed divine multiplication and sanctified offspring with the detached efficiency of a business manager reporting quarterly earnings. But as Thornton read deeper into the correspondence, the euphemistic language began to crack, revealing the horror beneath. A letter from May 1852 discussed disciplining Breeder 7 for resistance to her sacred duty. Another from November 1853 calculated the spiritual and temporal value of children born to women identified only by number. The Mother Superior maintained detailed records of each woman's reproductive capacity, tracking menstrual cycles and pregnancies with clinical precision. What chilled Thornton most was the theological framework Beaumont had constructed to justify the system. The Mother Superior argued that enslaved women, being children of Ham, according to contemporary racist theology, needed guidance from virtuous white women to fulfill their purpose. She claimed that by controlling their reproduction, the convent was performing an act of Christian mercy, bringing souls into the world under religious instruction, rather than leaving them to the moral chaos of secular plantations. The letters revealed that neighboring planters found the convent's practices extreme. One correspondence from a local landowner, dated 1854, questioned why the sisters kept their enslaved women in such isolation. "Even my most valued slaves enjoy Sunday gatherings and seasonal celebrations," he wrote. "Your women are never seen beyond your walls." Mother Superior Beaumont's response was coldly efficient. "Our sacred mission requires separation from worldly influences. The women under our care serve a higher purpose that secular minds cannot comprehend." By 1856, the correspondence showed cracks in the system. Several letters mentioned increasing resistance and spiritual recalcitrance among the enslaved women. One letter, written in hurried script, unlike Beaumont's usual careful penmanship, described an incident where 3 women had attempted to escape during a midnight mass. They were caught before reaching the property line and punished with corrective isolation that lasted 3 months. The letter made no mention of their names, referring to them only as Breeders 2, 11, and 13. The archive also contained financial records that revealed the economic motivation behind the spiritual rhetoric. The convent sold children born to the enslaved women to other Catholic institutions and wealthy families, justifying the transactions as placement in Christian households. Between 1851 and 1860, the convent recorded income from 37 such sales, each transaction blessed by the bishop and recorded in ledgers kept separate from the parish's official books. What struck Thornton as she compiled her findings was the institutional complicity. Bishop Marchand not only knew about the convent's operations, he actively facilitated them. His letters offered advice on managing difficult breeders, suggested theological arguments to counter criticism, and helped arrange sales of children to families throughout Louisiana and Mississippi. The church hierarchy had created a system where religious authority shielded systematic abuse from public scrutiny. Most haunting was the complete absence of the women's voices. Unlike other slavery-era documents where enslaved people occasionally left testimony through interviews, letters, or legal depositions, the 18 women at the Sisters of Divine Mercy convent remained utterly silent. The only evidence of their existence came through the cold calculations of their captors. Numbers in ledgers, references to breeding capacity, clinical observations about resistance or compliance. They had been erased so thoroughly that even their names had been lost to history, replaced by numerical designations that reduced them to functions rather than human beings. Chapter 2. The Sisters of Divine Mercy. The Convent of the Sisters of Divine Mercy was established in 1847 by Mother Superior Catherine Beaumont, a widow from a prominent New Orleans family. Beaumont had inherited a modest plantation after her husband's death, and, seeking to combine religious devotion with economic sustainability, convinced Bishop Marchand to grant her permission to establish a small religious community. The bishop saw opportunity in Beaumont's proposal, a self-sustaining convent that could serve as a model for other religious institutions in the expanding South. From the beginning, the convent operated differently from traditional religious houses. Rather than focusing on education or hospital work like most Catholic sisters, Beaumont's community maintained absolute isolation. Visitors were rare and always screened through the bishop's office. The sisters attended Mass at a private chapel rather than the parish church, and their charitable work, supposedly the distribution of food to the poor, occurred behind closed doors with no community witnesses. The convent purchased its first enslaved women in 1848, 6 months after establishment. Church records describe them as field workers to maintain the convent's agricultural needs, but the reality was far more calculated. Beaumont selected young women between ages 15 and 25, prioritizing those who had already given birth or shown fertility. She avoided purchasing women with children, explaining in a letter to the bishop that existing attachments complicate spiritual guidance. This seemingly compassionate concern masked a brutal truth. Beaumont wanted women who could be isolated completely, with no family connections to complicate her plans. By 1851, the convent housed 18 enslaved women and 6 white sisters. The ratio was deliberately designed, 3 enslaved women per sister, allowing for constant supervision. The daily schedule, reconstructed from fragmentary records, revealed a life of unrelenting control. The women woke at 4 a.m. for prayers led by the sisters, followed by work assignments that lasted until sunset. Meals were communal but silent, eaten under the watchful eyes of Sister Margaret, who served as Beaumont's enforcer and managed daily discipline. The convent's isolation was carefully maintained through architectural design. High walls surrounded the property, and the women's quarters were separated from the main convent building by a locked courtyard. Windows were small and positioned high on walls, preventing views of the surrounding countryside. The sisters justified this arrangement as protecting the women from worldly temptations, but it effectively created a prison that operated under religious authority. Mother Superior Beaumont's letters reveal her particular obsession with control over the women's reproductive lives. She implemented a system where each woman's fertility was tracked with the precision of a breeding operation. The convent kept detailed records of menstrual cycles, noting dates, duration, and any irregularities. When pregnancies occurred, the sisters documented every stage, providing medical care that was advanced for the era, but motivated by economic rather than humanitarian concerns. Healthy mothers produced valuable children who could be sold at higher prices. The theological justification Beaumont developed became more elaborate over time. She argued that enslaved women, being naturally inferior in reason, required moral guidance from virtuous white women to properly raise children. By removing newborns and placing them in Christian households, the convent was supposedly saving souls from the corrupting influence of enslaved culture. This paternalistic racism, wrapped in religious language, allowed Beaumont and her sisters to view themselves as moral actors even as they tore families apart. Contemporary accounts from neighboring plantation owners suggest that many found the convent's practices disturbing. A diary entry from Charles Dubois, who owned the adjacent property, noted in 1853 that he never heard singing or laughter from the convent's enslaved quarters. "My people gather on Sundays and make joyful noise," he wrote. But Mother Beaumont's workers exist in perpetual silence, like ghosts moving through the fields. This observation hints at the psychological toll of the convent's regime, not just physical control, but systematic suppression of any expression of joy, culture, or community. The question of who fathered the children born at the convent remained deliberately obscured in official records. Church documents refer vaguely to arranged unions and sanctified partnerships, but never identify specific men. Modern historians believe the convent likely arranged temporary liaisons with enslaved men from neighboring plantations, carefully controlled encounters designed solely for reproduction. Some evidence suggests the convent paid neighboring planters for breeding services, essentially renting enslaved men for specific purposes. This cold commercial transaction, blessed by religious authority, represented one of the most dehumanizing aspects of the entire operation. By 1855, cracks began appearing in the convent's carefully maintained facade. Several letters mention increasing difficulties with spiritual compliance, code for resistance among the enslaved women. One particularly revealing letter describes Sister Margaret's complaint that Breeder 11 refuses her sacred duty and spreads poisonous thoughts among others. The response from Mother Beaumont was chilling in its calculation: isolation, reduced rations, and what she called contemplative correction, likely solitary confinement in conditions severe enough to break resistance. Chapter 3. The Numbered Women. They existed without names in official records, identified only by numerical designations that reduced human beings to inventory. Breeder 1 through Breeder 18. This clinical terminology appeared consistently in the convent's ledgers, a deliberate erasure that served both practical and psychological purposes. By stripping away names, Mother Superior Beaumont removed the last vestige of individual identity, making it easier for the sisters to view the women as resources rather than people deserving dignity and compassion. Reconstructing the lives of these 18 women presents enormous challenges. Unlike many enslaved people who left traces through bills of sale, plantation records, or later testimony, the women at the Sisters of Divine Mercy convent were deliberately kept from any documentation that might humanize them. Parish birth records make no mention of their children. Death records, when they exist at all, list only female slave with an age and date. The convent maintained its own private ledgers, and even these reduced the women to their reproductive capacity and labor output. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. What we can piece together comes from fragments scattered across multiple archives. A letter from 1852 mentions that Breeder 4 had given birth to twins, both sold to a family in Natchez for premium prices. Another reference describes Washerwoman 7 as possessing unusual strength and stamina, but requiring frequent spiritual correction. These cold observations, written without empathy, represent the only evidence some of these women ever existed. Modern historical analysis suggests the women likely came from different plantations across Louisiana and Mississippi. Beaumont's purchasing strategy, evident in scattered sales records, targeted young women without strong family connections, those who had been sold away from parents, or whose children had already been taken. This calculated selection ensured minimal interference from enslaved communities that might question disappearances or advocate for separated families. The daily reality for these women combined exhausting physical labor with constant reproductive surveillance. Agricultural work occupied most daylight hours. The convent grew rice, vegetables, and maintained orchards that supplied both the sisters and local markets. But unlike other plantations where enslaved people might find moments of autonomy during work, the convent system included constant supervision by the sisters. Every action was observed, every interaction monitored, every moment of potential resistance identified and crushed. Pregnancy offered no respite. Women continued working until late in their term, then received medical attention from Sister Agnes, who had training as a midwife. After giving birth, they were allowed 2 weeks of reduced labor before returning to full duties. The newborns were kept in a communal nursery, tended by whichever women the convent designated as nursemaids, usually older women or those who had failed to conceive. This separation served multiple purposes. It prevented maternal bonding that might complicate later sales, and it reinforced the message that children belonged to the convent, not their mothers. The psychological torture of this system cannot be overstated. For enslaved women elsewhere, motherhood represented one of few spaces where they could exercise agency and create emotional connections. But at the Sisters of Divine Mercy, even this was stolen. Children were kept at deliberate distance, nursed on schedules determined by the sisters, and removed permanently once weaned. Letters mention women who displayed excessive attachment being punished with isolation until they learned proper spiritual detachment. Resistance, when it occurred, was met with calculated cruelty disguised as religious discipline. A ledger entry from 1854 describes Breeder 11 receiving contemplative correction after refusing to comply with an arranged union. The correction lasted 6 weeks, during which she was confined to a small room in the convent's cellar, allowed out only for prayers and minimum nutrition. When she emerged, according to the ledger, she demonstrated renewed spiritual compliance. This Orwellian language masked systematic torture designed to break the human spirit. Evidence suggests several women attempted suicide, though records describe these incidents as spiritual crises or demonic influences. One letter from Mother Beaumont to Bishop Marchand, dated July 1856, mentioned increased vigilance after Breeder 3 suffered a crisis of faith requiring medical intervention. The euphemistic language likely described a suicide attempt, prevented by the constant surveillance that left the women no privacy, even in their deepest despair. The complete isolation from the outside world intensified their suffering. Unlike enslaved people on traditional plantations who could form communities, share cultural traditions, and find moments of joy despite oppression, the women at the convent existed in enforced silence. Speaking was restricted to necessary communication about work tasks. Singing, storytelling, and any expression of African cultural heritage were forbidden as worldly distractions from spiritual growth. Even among themselves, the women had limited opportunity for solidarity. The sisters deliberately housed them in small groups to prevent organized resistance. Chapter 4. The Sacred Commerce. The economics of the convent's operation revealed the cold calculation behind religious rhetoric. Mother Superior Beaumont maintained meticulous financial records, separate from official church ledgers, documenting income from what she called Christian placements. Between 1851 and 1860, these records show 37 children sold to Catholic families throughout the South, generating revenue that kept the convent financially independent and increasingly profitable. Prices varied based on age, gender, and perceived health. Infants commanded premium prices because buyers could shape them from birth. Light-skinned children, a reality born from the convent's arranged unions with carefully selected enslaved men, sold for more because buyers valued what they called refined features. Mother Beaumont's ledgers noted these distinctions with brutal efficiency. Male infant, excellent coloring, sold to Delacroix family, New Orleans. $200, or female child, 3 years, placed with Sisters of Charity, Natchez, $800. The terminology of placement, rather than sale, served important psychological and legal functions. It allowed the sisters to maintain the fiction of charitable work, as if they were arranging adoptions rather than selling human beings. It also provided legal protection. During a period when some clergy began questioning the morality of slavery, the convent could point to placements in Christian households as evidence of humanitarian concern. The bishop reinforced this fiction in his correspondence, consistently referring to the transactions as spiritual arrangements that served the children's best interests. Buyers came from throughout Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Wealthy Catholic families seeking domestic servants who had been raised properly under religious supervision. The convent's reputation spread through elite social networks, with Mother Beaumont receiving letters of inquiry from as far as Charleston and Mobile. She carefully vetted each buyer, not from concern for the children's welfare, but to protect the convent's reputation and ensure payment. A letter from 1857 rejected one buyer because recent bankruptcy proceedings suggest financial instability, demonstrating that economic security mattered more than the child's treatment. The removal of children from their mothers followed a calculated protocol designed to minimize disruption while maximizing trauma control. Infants were typically sold between 6 months and 1 year, after weaning, but before strong verbal communication developed. The convent arranged removals at night when other women were locked in their quarters, preventing collective grief or resistance. Mothers woke to find their children gone, with no explanation beyond Sister Margaret informing them that God's will has provided a blessed home for the child. Some women never recovered from these losses. A cryptic ledger entry from 1858 notes that Breeder 7, following third removal, demonstrates diminished spiritual compliance and reduced fertility. The clinical language masked devastating psychological trauma. A woman who had lost 3 children in 3 years, each torn away in darkness, unable to mourn or even speak her grief. The entry concluded with cold calculation. May require replacement if fertility does not resume within 1 year. The convent's relationship with Bishop Marchand evolved into sophisticated complicity. Early letters show him offering cautious guidance, but by the mid-1850s, he actively facilitated the commerce. He helped arrange sales to families outside Louisiana, used church networks to identify buyers, and provided ecclesiastical blessing that legitimized transactions. In return, the convent donated generously to the diocese, funding new church construction and charitable works that enhanced Marchand's reputation. The quid pro quo was never stated explicitly in correspondence, but the pattern was unmistakable. The bishop protected the convent's operations, and the convent's profits funded diocesan ambitions. Financial records reveal another troubling dimension. The convent invested its profits in additional enslaved people. By 1860, it owned 24 individuals. The original 18 women plus 6 others purchased as the operation expanded. Beaumont wrote to the bishop in 1859 proposing to establish a second facility, suggesting the proven model could be replicated elsewhere in the diocese. The proposal included detailed financial projections, demonstrating expected returns on investment from scaled breeding operations. Only the outbreak of civil war prevented this expansion from occurring. The intersection of religious authority and economic exploitation created a powerful shield against criticism. When one priest, Father Joseph Blanchard, questioned the convent's practices in an 1857 letter to the Archbishop, Bishop Marchand responded with sharp rebuke. He defended the Sisters of Divine Mercy as women of exceptional piety, performing difficult spiritual work, and suggested that Blanchard's concerns reflected insufficient understanding of the unique challenges of managing inferior races. The Archbishop sided with Marchand, effectively ending any internal church discussion of the convent's operations. Modern economic historians have calculated that the Sisters of Divine Mercy convent generated revenue equivalent to a medium-sized plantation, despite occupying much less land and maintaining fewer enslaved workers. The profitability came entirely from systematic breeding and sales, an operation that combined features of agriculture, human trafficking, and religious enterprise. The success of this model, morally abhorrent but financially efficient, demonstrated how institutions could weaponize religious authority to justify and profit from systematic dehumanization. Chapter 5. The Rebellion That Never Was. In the spring of 1859, something shifted within the walls of the Sisters of Divine Mercy convent. The change wasn't documented in official correspondence. Mother Superior Beaumont's letters to Bishop Marchand maintained their usual tone of controlled authority. But fragmentary evidence suggests that the 18 enslaved women attempted something historians hesitate to call a full rebellion, though it represented the most significant act of collective resistance in the convent's history. The first indication appeared in a hurried letter dated April 3, 1859, where Beaumont wrote to the bishop requesting immediate assistance with severe spiritual disorder. Unlike her usual precise prose, this letter contained crossed-out words and blotted ink, suggesting it was written in distress. She described coordinated disobedience and poisonous influence spreading among those under our care. She requested permission to implement extreme corrective measures and asked whether the bishop could arrange temporary housing for some women at a nearby plantation until spiritual order is restored. What actually happened remains unclear, pieced together from incomplete records and the physical evidence discovered much later. The most detailed account comes from a diary entry by Charles Dubois, the neighboring plantation owner, dated April 5, 1859. Dubois noted that he heard unusual commotion from the convent around midnight, including what sounded like shouting and the ringing of alarm bells. By morning, everything had returned to silence. But Dubois observed increased activity around the convent walls and noticed that Sister Margaret made an uncharacteristic visit to the local sheriff's office. Ledger entries from late April show significant changes. 3 women, designated as Breeders 2, 11, and 15, disappeared from the active roster without explanation. A note in the margin, in different handwriting than usual, reads simply, "Transferred, disciplinary necessity." Where these women went and what happened to them remains unknown. They vanished from all subsequent records, their fates lost to the deliberate destruction of documentation. Evidence suggests the precipitating event was the sale of a child born to Breeder 11, a woman who appeared repeatedly in correspondence as particularly resistant to the convent's control. Unlike most sales conducted at night with minimal notice, this one occurred during daylight while the women worked in the fields. Several saw the transaction, a well-dressed couple arriving in a carriage, Sister Margaret bringing a toddler from the nursery, money exchanging hands. The visual confirmation of what the women had long suspected, that their children were being sold like livestock, apparently broke whatever fragile compliance the convent had maintained. What happened next can only be inferred. The women likely gathered that night, perhaps in the sleeping quarters, perhaps in the courtyard during the brief evening prayer period. They must have discussed their situation, shared their grief, and decided on some form of collective action. The specifics remain unknown, but the aftermath suggests it was significant enough to terrify the sisters and require intervention from outside authorities. Sister Agnes, the convent's midwife, left a brief memoir late in life that contained a cryptic passage about the night of great difficulty, when our faith was tested by those who could not comprehend God's plan for them. She described how the sisters prayed through the darkness while securing the facility, and how Mother Beaumont demonstrated exceptional courage in restoring order. Reading between the euphemisms, it appears the women may have attempted to escape, possibly even threatening or confronting the sisters directly. The response was swift and brutal. Correspondence from late April mentions reinforced security measures, including hiring a local overseer named Thomas Garrett to provide additional supervision. This was unprecedented. The convent had always prided itself on managing the enslaved women without male overseers, viewing it as evidence of their superior spiritual authority. Hiring Garrett represented an admission that control had slipped, requiring secular force to supplement religious authority. The disappearance of the three women served as a warning to others. Church records contain no explanation of where they went, and later attempts by historians to trace their fates have proven futile. Some speculation suggests they were sold to the Deep South, Alabama or Mississippi, where plantation owners asked fewer questions about troubled purchases. Others believe they may have been placed in particularly harsh conditions at nearby plantations as punishment, their presence serving as cautionary tales to other enslaved communities. What makes this episode particularly tragic is that it represented the women's best chance for collective action, and it failed completely. The institutional power of the church, combined with the convent's isolation and the complicity of local authorities, meant that even organized resistance had no chance of success. The sheriff's records from 1859 make no mention of any incident at the convent, suggesting that any investigation was quietly suppressed. The women who remained behind learned a devastating lesson. Not even solidarity could overcome the combined weight of religious authority and slavery's legal structures. The aftermath brought increased surveillance and stricter control. New rules prohibited the women from gathering in groups larger than 3 without direct sister supervision. Speaking was further restricted to absolute necessity. Evening prayer time was shortened, reducing the one period when the women might exchange even brief words. Mother Beaumont wrote to the bishop in May 1859 that order has been restored through vigilant spiritual guidance, but her request to maintain the hired overseer indefinitely suggested lingering fear that the women's defiance might resurface. Most haunting is the silence that descended after this failed resistance. Prior letters had mentioned occasional individual acts of defiance, a woman who required spiritual correction or showed insufficient compliance. But after spring 1859, such references disappeared from correspondence. Either the women had been thoroughly broken, or Mother Beaumont had learned to hide problems more effectively. The silence itself became part of the convent's control, making resistance invisible by refusing to acknowledge it ever occurred. Chapter 6. The Truth Buried in Walls. The Sisters of Divine Mercy Convent closed in April 1863, 2 years into the Civil War, as Union forces advanced through Louisiana. Mother Superior Catherine Beaumont and her remaining sisters fled to family estates in rural Mississippi, taking whatever portable wealth they could carry. The enslaved women, accounts vary on whether it was still 18 or fewer after years of death and disappearance, were presumably freed when Union troops reached the area, though no military records document their liberation or subsequent fate. They vanished into the chaos of war, their stories lost to history. For 156 years, the convent building stood abandoned, its walls concealing secrets that would have remained buried, if not for a combination of natural disaster and historical accident. Hurricane Laura struck Louisiana in August 2020, and the storm's fury tore away portions of the convent's south wall. The damage revealed a space that shouldn't have existed according to architectural records. A bricked-up room measuring approximately 12 feet by 15 feet, hidden between the main convent structure and the women's quarters. If this story has drawn you in, leave a like. It helps the story of the 18 women reach more people. When restoration workers entered the sealed room in November 2020, they found it filled with documents that Mother Beaumont had hidden before fleeing. The cache included the private ledgers documenting births, sales, and financial transactions. More disturbing were personal items: small cloth dolls, a handmade comb carved from wood, a piece of fabric with stitching that might have been decorative or might have represented a name. These objects, the only physical evidence the women ever existed, suggested they had found ways to create and hide small pieces of personal identity, despite the convent's attempts to strip them of everything. The room also contained remains. Forensic examination revealed the bones of at least 3 individuals, adult females who had been buried beneath the floor. Initial analysis suggested they died between 1855 and 1862, consistent with the convent's operational period. Cause of death couldn't be determined from skeletal evidence alone, but the hidden burial site raised disturbing questions. Why were these women buried secretly rather than in the convent cemetery? What circumstances of their deaths required concealment? Modern DNA analysis of the remains, conducted by Louisiana State University in 2021, revealed that the 3 women shared genetic markers with contemporary African American families in the region. Genealogical research traced connections to current residents of Baton Rouge and surrounding parishes, confirming that descendants of the 18 women still live in Louisiana. These descendants had grown up hearing vague family stories about ancestors who worked at a religious place or disappeared into a convent, oral histories that had seemed too fragmentary to pursue until the physical evidence emerged. The documents found in the sealed room included correspondence never sent, drafts of letters where Beaumont struggled to justify the convent's operations, crossed out theological arguments, abandoned attempts to rationalize systematic cruelty. One particularly revealing draft, dated 1860, showed Beaumont grappling with doubts. Some question whether our work truly serves divine purpose or merely earthly profit. But she never sent this letter, and subsequent drafts returned to confident assertions about spiritual duty and sacred mission. The internal struggle revealed in these documents suggested that even Beaumont understood, at some level, the moral horror of what she orchestrated. Perhaps most valuable for historians were daily logs kept by Sister Margaret, the sister who managed discipline and supervision. Unlike Beaumont's careful euphemisms, Margaret's notes were brutally direct. She recorded punishments without religious justification. Breeder 7, reduced rations for 3 days after speaking to Breeder 4 during work. Breeder 11, isolated for 1 week after attempting to enter nursery. These stark entries, stripped of theological pretense, revealed the violence inherent in the system that polite correspondence had obscured. The discovery prompted the Catholic Church to commission an internal investigation, completed in 2023. The report acknowledged grave moral failings and systematic abuse of vulnerable people at the Sisters of Divine Mercy Convent. It confirmed that Bishop Marchand not only knew about the operations, but actively facilitated them, profiting financially while providing ecclesiastical protection. The church offered formal apology to descendants and pledged to preserve the site as a memorial, though critics argued that institutional reckoning came far too late to matter to those who suffered. Current descendants of the 18 women have mixed reactions to the discoveries. Some welcome the validation of family stories, the confirmation that their ancestors existed and endured unimaginable trauma. Others find the attention painful, forcing engagement with horrors they would prefer to leave buried. Several descendants have requested genetic analysis to determine which of the 3 buried women might be their ancestor, hoping to finally give names to the numbered women in the ledgers. The convent building now serves as a historical site managed by the Louisiana Historical Society. Visitors can see the sealed room where documents were hidden, view reproductions of the ledgers documenting births and sales, and stand in the small quarters where 18 women lived under constant surveillance. Educational displays explain the intersection of religion and slavery, how institutional authority can shield systematic abuse, and why it took over 150 years for this story to emerge. But the site remains incomplete. Of the 18 women who lived and suffered within those walls, only 3 have been physically recovered. The others remain missing, buried in unmarked graves, their remains lost to time, their final resting places unknown. Even their names remain unrecovered. Despite extensive archival research, historians have been unable to identify who these women were before they became numbers in Mother Beaumont's ledgers. The erasure she implemented so efficiently in life persists even now, decades after every institution involved has acknowledged wrongdoing. Subscribe to this channel to discover more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Sisters of Divine Mercy Convent. See you in the next video. The 18 women of the Sisters of Divine Mercy Convent were systematically erased from history, their names replaced with numbers, their children stolen and sold, their resistance crushed, their graves hidden or lost. For more than 150 years, the institution that claimed to serve God built its prosperity on their suffering, then concealed that truth so thoroughly that even their descendants couldn't know their full story. But silence isn't permanence. Documents hidden in walls outlast the institutions that tried to bury them. Bones remain long after names are forgotten. Oral histories persist through generations, waiting for the day when physical evidence finally validates what was whispered but never proven. The truth is always patient. It waits in sealed archives, beneath floorboards, in the genetic memory of descendants who carry the past in their DNA. And when it finally emerges, through storms that tear down walls or historians who refuse to stop asking questions, it demands that we remember not the institutions that claimed righteousness, but the human beings they reduced to numbers, the voices they silenced, the lives they stole under the cover of religious authority. The 18 women deserve to be remembered by name, to be honored as individuals, to have their stories told with dignity. That chance was stolen from them, but their suffering won't be erased again. Their story, finally unearthed, stands as testament to the humans who survived unimaginable cruelty and the institutions that must finally account for crimes committed in God's name.